Hi everybody and welcome back to the painting channel for this week. Today I'm doing a little bit of a wet subject, watercolour, but a wet street in London. I fancied doing this after a visit to the capital with a friend of mine very recently to see the Edward Seago show. And I'm glad I went, but the heavens opened when we came out of the main gallery. And so we felt that there was a great opportunity to take a few photographs, especially around Trafalgar Square, which is really where I'm standing and painting this one. And I just fancied doing it, in all honesty. I loved all the reflections that were in the big, broad footpaths, or the big, I don't know what you call them, big slabs anyway, you know, not normal paving slabs. These were giant ones. And they just acted as mirrors and reflected all the people walking to and fro. So that's what attracted me to doing this, and I felt that it would be nice done in watercolour, loose and fresh, or as fresh as I could make it. Now this is quite a complex drawing, it has to be said, and as you'll see during this time lapse that I did use the eraser many times. It was a true friend on this occasion, but there was a lot to get right, or a lot to change and keep altering until you were about there. One of the biggest things is I set a very rough perspective point. There were many perspective points that should have been observed, but I sort of kept it to a little bit, and I wanted to trust those instincts to get it to look a little bit right. Now all the people, this is what half of this painting is about, not just the rain, not just the wet day, but also the people. I wanted to follow on from a recent video I did where I was giving you some idea on how to paint or put figures into a watercolor. Well, this time I wanted to do a painting that put those figures into context. That was part of the drive behind doing this for you this week, and I'm glad I did. But it was a mammoth painting. Actually, the full version of this on Patreon is an hour, nearly an hour and 3/4 long. So if you are one of my patrons, be prepared. It's quite a long haul on this particular painting, but I think it was worthwhile, and I enjoyed the process, even though that it got away from me very quickly and I nearly lost it a couple of times. But essentially we got there in the end, as you'll see hopefully by the end of this. Now for the painting process. The drawing is done. I didn't want to give it too much, but I used a lot of the old gunk that was on the painting already. So sort of the greys and washes from before made the sky. I added some indigos and some other blues just to give that sky a bit more form. And it is a dead cloudy day in many respects. So there wasn't an awful lot of light coming in. And I felt that it needed that extra little punch of different colors. One thing I will say right from the start is a lot of the colors that I used were down to two. I used raw sienna and ultramarine violet extensively in this whole painting, so the swings between the warms and the cools in this picture were really down to just two pigments on the palette. And I just felt that it didn't really need to do any more than that. It was just washes and the feeling of lights and darks and the warms and the cools accordingly. So I just carried on. I didn't see the point. I think at one point I did actually use some transparent orange in this just to make it a little bit richer in the darks, but essentially it's just the two colors. And what I'm doing now is just lifting out a little bit around the sky and through that church steeple. I did use a pretty heavy pencil. I say heavy, it wasn't heavy, it was actually a 2B lead, but it was a thick lead, so it allowed me some heavier pencil marks. Not everybody likes that, so what I would say to you is that if you're not sure about that, use a standard pencil 2 to 4B and give yourself a softer line, maybe not as heavy as I've done. But I just felt that sometimes the paint can be picked up the pencil and move it around, and it does some interesting things. I've used a little bit more of the ultramarine violet, but I put a bit of neutral tint to this to give me those grayer buildings and darks, basically in that church opposite and the steeple, also the buildings, and I've allowed certain parts to dry up a little bit, but to allow me to put more darks in. Suggestive reflections from the National Gallery on the left hand side, warms and cools, more of that violet, more of that warm raw sienna, and I'm lifting out either side just to accentuate the wetness, or what seems to be the wetness. I'm dragging the brush, as you'll see, horizontally across the plane, so it drags colors from one area to another, and it really diffuses the light and the issues, and therefore it looks like puddles or wet watery reflective surfaces. All the time I'm looking, I'm checking, I'm judging, but now I decided that it was really time to dry it all off and to start on the next layer. And the next layer is more refinement, darks, more of the ultramarine, a little bit sienna, and some of the orange coming in now, so that I can make my darks either very warm or very cool, depending on where I want them to go. I put a bit of paper towel down because I was going to do quite a lot of work on the buildings. I did not want to put grease or marks on the paper indirectly, so I was a little bit careful of that. Here I'm trying to observe a lot more of the columns, the colonnades. I don't know what you call them, but I think I got the right number. That was a bit difficult. I had to count it up a couple of times to try and establish. And of course, by the time you get the furthest end of that frontage, those columns look just like little lines because they're so close together on the foreshortening that you don't actually see individual marks. Whereas on this end, of course, they are that much closer to me, and I can see a lot more detail. So I really wanted to suggest that in this picture. The windows are simple marks, simple lines, simple dabs of the brush, including the fencing that's going in now on the end of the building. It's a little bit of greenness, a little bit of grass on that area there, but I did try and observe that. But the whole thing needs to be wet, and that's what this painting is really about. I just wanted to have the effect of this wetness, and it was important, and I've longed to get up to London on a wet day. I've got to say, for ages. I don't get a lot of chance to get up to London, but when I do, I long for it to be a wet, rainy day, and just to get all of those car lights in the road, in the wet reflective surfaces. It's great. I didn't get too much chance to do that on this occasion, but it was getting towards the end of the day, and I just wanted to do something. So my friend was really sweet and sort of put up with me flashing around with my camera and doing all this stuff. And I've got to say that it was still raining. People were walking around with their brollies. We were getting wet too. So I couldn't do too much of it, as much as I really wanted to. But my friend would have put up with it. She's such a sweetheart, and she knew how important that doing something like this was to me. Here I was putting a few suggested windows in the buildings way over the other side. I actually put in the center of it one more than I should have done. But hey, I'm not going to count. I'm not worried. I'm sure that no one else is going to be too worried by it. But it just gives you the idea of masses of architecture that fill the London or central London streets. Where I'm painting now is down beyond the church, and that road actually takes you all the way back down to Charing Cross. I say all the way down, it's not that far. It's just a couple of 100 yards, and you're on the junction and looking at the well-known train station opposite you, which is Charing Cross. And I'm just putting a bit more detail in, just one or two dark marks. They will dry up lighter. As you can see, all those reflective surfaces that I've already put in and dried them off, you can see how wet that surface really is starting to look. And I'm adding some more detail now into the church beyond. I didn't want it as dark as the National Gallery, but it still had to have some degree of depth to it, because it is the second most important aspect to the painting in terms of composition and the direction of information. All the other buildings beyond it are quite simply there as a supporting act. So, you know, this National Gallery on the left, the church right ahead of me, those are the supporting or main parts of the painting. Of course, the main or the real part of the painting are the people. That's why I did that. I tried to put this little statue in. I say a little statue, a massive statue of a rider, and I'm not sure. I ought to know who this is, but I must say I apologise. I don't know. It actually stands on a plinth at the head of Trafalgar Square. I put a couple of London buses in, and I also started to suggest some of the plane trees. I think they're plane trees. They're the most common tree in this part of London. They're a wonderful bark on them, and they just make some magnificent examples along the sides of the roads in central London. Now, a couple of the more decorative lamp standards, and I'm putting a few dark marks in, just simple takes on them, a little hood and a little bit of the apparatus around the lamp standard. But I also felt that I didn't want to put too much in. And I'm going to come back in with some gouache later just to really tap away with some lights. Now I'm starting to put the people in. If you notice, it doesn't matter what or how close a person is to me in this picture. Their heads are all roughly the same level. It may not look it on those forward ones, but I haven't actually painted the top of them yet. But if you look at them at the end, you'll see that I painted them, if they're way off or if they're really close, around about eye level. And that will always be the case. Unless you've got somebody who's very small or very tall, outside of that normal thing, then they will be on the eye level or your eye level, your horizon line. That's really what you're thinking of when it comes to painting masses of people in a picture. Keep all their heads roughly on the same level. Sorry to labour that point, but it really is quite important. And the other thing, of course, is that, you know, whether they are facing you or walking away from you, I've not tried to paint individual characters within the painting of this one. In other paintings, for sure, you can do all of those things. All I wanted to do is give you the essence of painting many, many people in a scene that is predominantly about the town or about London, about the rain, but it's just never without people. You could do the same thing if you were in Venice, you know, tons of people guaranteed there all the time. But the main structures of the buildings make the painting. It's the people that fill the interest. And in this case, of course, we've got the added thing with the water and the rain and those wonderful reflections. Not to mention all the reflections from all the people. So it really is important. But I'm just tweaking a few of these watery effects now in the foreground. Going over one or two areas that got a little bit softer, a bit darker here and a bit darker there. I'm lifting out a little bit where there's a sort of depression between the paving slabs, so it showed a little bit of a white line. So I wanted to try and put that in, not by painting a white line, but by painting around the negative space. One thing when you're painting water or you're painting reflections, try and keep all your strokes as much as you can horizontal. They need to be that way. Water doesn't sort of go up and down in that sense. It will appear level and even, and try and remember to do that. Now I'm going back to adding more people in, and you can see right at the back there I'm tapping them in. These are just marks, simple marks with the brushes, but I'm thinking people in my head. I've also helped that I've got the reference nearby for sure, but I'm adding a little bit of colour to those closest to me. In this case, a little bit of vermilion going in on this figure, and it's a central figure, but it really makes a nice statement against the reflections of the church. So I'm quite happy the way that one is going, and I sort of come back to it and have a look at that value of the reflection again. I did actually make the red a little darker, but I also did, and I'm using, I've got to say, I forgot, I'm using a rigger for a lot of this part of it because I like the sensitivity that a rigger gives me, and it can give me those little soft marks that I'm looking for, and I can just flick it off to one side or another, or leave a bit of white paper or under paper unpainted, and I can suggest that there are watery marks and reflective marks with that in that way. This person's pushing a wheelchair. I do remember seeing that, although it's not in the reference that I use, but I do remember somebody carrying a child and somebody pushing an empty pushchair ahead of them, so I included that. I'm adding some more reflections now to these people walking across the front of the National Gallery. I do believe that there was a couple of street, or certainly one street entertainer further up. I didn't actually have him in my picture. There was at one point a big crowd standing in the rain watching him, and indeed I did for a little while. It was quite entertaining and it was quite fun, but it was sort of it spoiled the focus of the whole image. So I waited for that to change, and then I got some shots of people going about their business, trying to avoid the heavy deluge that came and went as time went on. So a few umbrellas and lots of people just walking one way or the other. And I don't think it matters too much if I've got them facing one way or another. They're just figures in the landscape. And I think that at the end of the day, they really do make this composition. You know, we've got those buildings, as I said, they are all supporting and they are creating the environment. But these people bring the whole scene to life. The rain brings the people to life because they are anchored to the terra firma and they have physical presence, but their reflections add them to the ground, and that really is important. There's nothing worse than having people sort of floating in the air without any sort of structure that puts them to the ground, and so the reflections really do that. And the other thing is that you create a beautiful sense of contrast because you've got the lighter, beautiful soft values of the reflective water of the sky, which makes the foreground look very, very light unless it's in contact with the reflection of one of the big buildings, which there are two in this case. But the people just give you a wonderful sense of contrast with them and their reflections, and they do work very, very well. Now I've got the gouache out and I'm going in with one or two white marks across the top of the two London buses that I put in, the street lamps, and also heads and shoulders on some of the people. Now, it wasn't a big sunny day, we've established that, but even so there will still be highlights to be seen on the people. Don't forget, they are pretty wet, some of them, and they're going to reflect a lot more light because of that wet surface, especially if they got sort of shiny waterproof type coats on. They're going to be quite reflective, so you're going to get away with putting some highlights on them. And I actually added a little bit of Indian yellow to this mix as well because I wanted a bit of a warm highlights from some of the lights and reflected lights. I put some of those in that grey just under the horse statue and a few other areas that just reflected some of the street lights that were on, and they were reflecting through the dark. So it had the opposite effect actually. It was really good because you know you had the dark reflections of the people, but you had in the dark areas you had these wonderful chances to put these light reflections of the street lights, and that was fantastic. That really did work for me. So I'm sort of coming to the end of the whole thing now, and I'm getting to the point where I'm just looking at little bits, tapping a bit more information here and there. I added a bit more to that figure in the center. I felt that he needed changing. It wasn't quite reading right, so I felt that I needed a bit more work to that and changed a little bit on the figure to the right. But essentially, we're pretty much done. And I'm getting to the point now where I'm just looking and I'm going to sign the picture. I'm done. I'm finished. Now, what I will say is I'm really happy with this. I hope you've enjoyed watching it. I hope you have a go at this too. And at the same time, don't forget you can see the full version on my Patreon. And yeah, I'll see you all next week anyway, guys. Happy painting. See you next Friday. All the best for now. Catch you all soon. Bye bye.